See, we're live. We are streaming a couple of places, but we're definitely on Facebook. So I'm excited about what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to jump right in. And usually sometimes I wait for people to come in, but I think this is going to be a fruitful conversation, and I kind of want to get started. So I'm excited to have you two on tonight, that you volunteered to come. I was kind of scared to ask anybody to come do this, and because I didn't want anybody to feel uncomfortable. This isn't a comfortable situation for minorities. This isn't a comfortable conversation for white people. It's just not comfortable. Right. And it shouldn't be. And right. So when I had this idea of doing this show and providing a platform for people who don't look like me to come on and we talk about racism together, I said, well, let me just put it out there and see who'll bite the bullet. So I am so glad that Chris and Dr. A, we're going to call you Dr. A tonight. Okay. That's what we affectionately call you. That I was so excited that you guys both agreed to come on. So we're going to do some brief introductions. Chris, if you could give us a brief introduction of who you are and where you're located, and kind of give the audience a little bit about yourself.
Well, my name is Chris, and I am located in Waynesville, Missouri, which is the bedroom community for Fort Leonard Wood. So anybody that's been in the military probably knows where Fort Leonard Wood is. There's a training base for all 4 branches, I guess 5 branches if you count the Coast Guard. But I've been all over the world. I'm very well traveled. I've traveled to China, and I lived in Germany for 7 years and been all over the place. I've spent probably 22 years in corporate retail for 2 Fortune 50 companies. In both, I was in the Washington, D.C. market for a long time. Spent several years in the Chicago market before moving back to Missouri. I've held leadership roles in operations, sales leadership, and spent the last 10 years of my career in human resources. So I'm a little bit well-traveled. I live in rural Missouri. I spent lots of years in metro markets, but now I'm in rural Missouri. I own a small music store in my hometown, and I'm with Sharon. I'm getting ready to finish up, hopefully in 2020, with my doctorate degree, and looking forward to just helping people wherever I can. So ask any questions. I have had some really intense conversations in the last few weeks with people that look differently than me. And I was afforded to ask some really hard questions. And people were very gracious to answer them. And so I want to do the same thing tonight. So whatever I can answer, please ask away.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for that introduction. Dr. A, if you can kind of tell our audience who you are.
Thank you so much for having me here, Sharon. I mean, it's such an honor. So I guess you guys probably don't know who I am. I'm Adrienne Isakovich. They are calling me Dr. A because until very recently, and we won't go into the administrative reasons why, I was the dissertation mentor for both Sharon and Chris. And so even though I'm not on their committee anymore, I am behind the scenes their biggest cheerleader. So I'm very excited to see both of them finish up this year. It's been a journey for both of them. So I am obviously a professor. I'm currently at Northwest Missouri State University, and similarly to Chris, very well traveled and somehow lived in pretty much everywhere else in the world and came to rural Missouri. So I think there's this track here. I don't know, but not sure how this ends up. I actually spent about 20 years living overseas, mainly in the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates, 2 years in Saudi Arabia. I've also lived in China and traveled a lot for work and for leisure. And moved back to the U.S. in September 2016. So I've actually been going through quite an adjustment, even though the U.S. is my home country, trying to figure out what life is like for me now in a very different cultural environment from what I grew used to overseas. And certainly coming to the Midwest, I'd never even been here before, and now I live here. So that's a very different scenario. And of course, you know, we have watched, honestly, our country since 2016, well, I know since earlier, but certainly that's for me, since I came back in 2016, become increasingly divided. And I wasn't expecting that great of a division when I came back. When you're outside of the US, things, obviously you have a different perspective on what's happening. And your news channels are different, your news sources are different. And so, you know, I've been watching divisions within the US with great concern, but then it just kind of seemed to explode. So that's informing my perspectives as well, as someone who is very American and certainly very white, but lived overseas in a very different culture for a very long time. So my focus, or my specialty, is also human resources. And when I was in the UAE, I spent about 10 of those years as an academic off and on, and the other 10 years in startup organizations, both corporate and even government. I helped to establish a university there and hire in the first faculty members, the first president, and everybody else of the university. So my focus has always been on people and the impact of structures and society and culture and all sorts of other things on people in the workplace, especially. Mm-hmm. And so I now focus on teaching, you know, and my research, but teaching mainly undergraduates, some graduates. And I'm probably one of the weirdest business professors out there, because on my first day in class, I say, it's not about the bottom line. Forget the profit. That will come. Focus on the people first. And they're like, well, that's not what the other business professors say. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's what it is.
Well, we are people
first. We'll see if I get tenure with that.
People first. People are your most valuable asset.
If you don't take care of your people, the profit's not coming. So
exactly.
And somebody else will.
So I'm excited to have both of you. What I'm so curious about, because both of you are very well traveled, you've lived other places besides the United States. And so that's one thing I'm really impressed about, because you're able to give us a perspective, not just US based. And so my question would be, and I wanted to start with racism first, even though I know it says white privilege and racism, because I believe racism is the base for how we get to white privilege, if I make any sense. So I wanted to give a working definition to people of what racism is. Racism is individual and group level processes and structures that are implicated in the reproduction of racial inequality. And I put my APA citation for all of you guys out there because that's not my definition. So I wanted to give credit where credit is due as to who gave this working definition. I really wanted to talk about your experience with views of racism outside of the United States, and then kind of bring it into the United States and where we are now specifically. So Chris, I'm going to start with you, because again, I don't know, I haven't lived anywhere else. I haven't had that opportunity, but I'm wondering what racism looks like out there.
Well, that's a fantastic question. So when I lived in Germany, so I moved there, I guess I was in 4th grade. And my father was in the military. Our school was not on a military base. So there was a lot of time. So we were there from 85 to about 89. And so the climate there was very different. There was times that the German people did not want the American military in their country. And so there were times, I remember growing up, going to school, and our school buses didn't leave. And the biggest reason they didn't leave is we could count on at least 2 days a week going home early because of bomb threats. It was just a really weird childhood growing up. There were times when we were over there that the military was placed on alert, and our families weren't allowed to leave our house for 30 days at a time because people were protesting the fact that the military was there. So for me, it was, as a child, it was very different. So it gives me a different perspective on what racism looks like in the United States. It's not to the extent that I feel like the Black community and people of color experience it every day. But even in China, I remember Dr. Isakovich can probably know this, but you get off the plane in China and you're immediately surrounded by 200 Chinese folks just staring at you because your skin is different. We traveled in Beijing and Shenyang and Harbin, which all three cities have very different cultural influence, but everywhere we went, we created traffic jams just because people had never seen white people before. And so I don't know that it was a negative racism in China. I don't feel like it was like that for me in China. But certainly in Germany, there was lots of times, the neighborhood I lived in, there was a lot of Turkish people, and they just like to fight Americans. And so it was, you can imagine being on a playground, it was just very different. So, so I can understand a little bit to a small degree what people of color in the United States feel like. And you shouldn't have to feel like that every day.
Now, Chris, what are you observing now? Like, you're in rural Missouri. So, of course, I'm in New Jersey. I'm in the Northeast. Of course, we have Governor Cuomo, who we call the Northeast governor right now. He's constantly on the news and talking every day. However, I know, because you're in Missouri, like what's happening there? What is the climate there when it comes to dealing with people of color and racism in Missouri? Like, what is that?
So it's very different in the community that I live in. I live in a military community, and growing up a military dependent, there were times where I was in classes where I was one of 3 or 4 white people, and everybody else were people of different colors or ethnic backgrounds. So right here, things are good. We had a peaceful protest a few weeks ago in the park. Very productive, had a huge turnout. So about 500 people in a small rural community, very peaceful. But you don't have to get 20 miles outside of the town that I live in to experience racism. For instance, there's a town just a little bit away. When we first moved to Missouri, so this just shows my ignorance a little bit. My parents were driving through different communities looking for a place to live, and I remember coming to an intersection and thinking, oh, well, that's a really cool teepee in those people's front yard. And we get a little bit closer, and the words KKK were written across the teepee. And to my parents, when they tried to explain to us, it was a giant Klan hat sitting in somebody's front yard that looked like a teepee.
Wow.
So that was probably in the early 90s. And so I think for this part, there are communities still in central Missouri. They don't wear the Klan hat anymore. They wear shirts and ties and suits, and they're in the system, and it's systemic. And so more covert than overt, but it's still pretty big. When the community came out and said, hey, we're going to have a protest, people in this area were threatening the local businesses with rifles.
Wow.
It's really exposed some folks, even some local leaders. It's really exposed some people because in the 92, when I was in high school here in town, they had the KKK march through town, and it was no big deal.
Wow.
And so it's just a little bit, it's different. I think people in this day and age tend to hide their racism, but a lot of folks in this area that are on my Facebook feed are not there anymore because they really
that block function is brilliant.
Yeah, I've, to be honest with you, the last few weeks has just been very emotional, and I'm not an emotional guy. Mm-hmm. And just every time I log on to Facebook, I don't know, you can just see the hate. I've had so many people around this area that have posted the Confederate flag and said, if this offends you, unfriend me. And I was like, I think I will. So you just hit that button. And even people that I have spent 30 years in some type of relationship with, maybe not very intimate, but type of relationship with, I can't make that connection anymore. So
wow,
it's just very different.
Dr. A, if you want to chime in and kind of give your experience and your thoughts.
Yeah, well, it's funny that Chris mentioned his experience in China, because I think that was the first time I ever realized on a personal level that people will look at you differently because of the color of your skin. Because I will say that my parents, even though I was born in Alabama, raised in Georgia, you can't get more Southern than that, I don't think. And summers were spent with my grandmother in a tiny town of 2,000 people in rural Alabama, and we'd go, run the beans at my uncle's farm that had no electricity and had an outhouse. I mean, it's stereotypical rural South. But my parents were not overtly anti-racist, but the way that they raised me was, oh, you heard that word? No, that word is never said in this house, or, things like this. So I was kind of raised in this white privileged cocoon, with my parents, and didn't really have an understanding of what it means to be the minority until I went to China. And I was an exchange student. And as Chris said, when you're the only person of a color that doesn't match anybody else, it draws a lot of attention. And I remember one time on the train, and I was a very, very poor college student, so I was always riding in the very lowest class of the train. I was not in first class or anything. And I remember one time with some friends of mine, and we're going out to away from the cities and to a province in the inland. And these Chinese must have been, they're very rural because of their accent and their the vocabulary that they used, but they were talking about me, and they didn't know I spoke Chinese. And they're saying, oh yeah, look at the foreign devil, look at that, look at her blue eyes, they're like a devil's eyes. And I'm going, my eyes are hazel, they're not blue, and look at her big nose. And so they were stereotyping the idea of the foreign devil onto me, even though a lot of the characteristics that they were saying actually were not the case. And I remember thinking, damn, this is really weird that they're so fixated on me being so different. And I was like, okay, this is strange. Now, in the UAE, it was actually a very different story. Now, the UAE is for all intents and purposes, a benevolent police state. It's not a democracy by any means. But I say benevolent because for the most part, as long as you lived your life the way you wanted to, and you didn't raise up anything to the authorities, they left you alone, right? So there's a lot of things that are illegal in the UAE that are not here, such as being, homosexual, or dating even is illegal and could put you in jail or get you deported, but they didn't care as long as it wasn't raised to their attention. So what was really fascinating was in the UAE so the UAE is the size of South Carolina, population of about 10 million. 85% of that population comes from somewhere else in the world. Only 15% of the population is Emirati. So really, there's about 200 nationalities all living and working together, even those that have political or religious kind of tensions, like India and Pakistan, for example. Mm-hmm. But all in the UAE, and again, part of it is it's a police state. So there's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of press, those types of things. So that actually curbs a lot of behavior and forces a situation where a lot of the issues that we see among culturally around racism in the US, I did not see there at all. Now, also the biggest systematic divide was if you're not Emirati, then you are expatriate. And there were certainly a class level that if you got into a traffic accident with another expatriate, your nationality could have a bearing on the outcome. And if you got into a traffic accident with an Emirati, forget it. The Emirati is going to win, even if it's totally their fault. Those things are changing now because the leadership of the country is trying to change that. So it was less of, there really wasn't a racism issue there at all. It was really more of a class or a nationality issue, if you will. Yes. Now, I will say this, having, being from HR, of course, most of my attention has been on international HR, but then when I came back to the States, I wanted to start exploring, more of domestic HR, right? Because that would be more meaningful for my students. And that's where I became really astounded at some of the research, and I know we'll probably talk about this, about just how embedded racism is into a lot of our processes and things. And but just to go back to your original question, so like Chris, we had a demonstration here as well a couple weeks ago, and it temporarily got moved to be a virtual demonstration because we had these idiots using their real names boldly posting on the sheriff's Facebook page, which is where, the link for the everything, posting that they were going to set up sniper positions and take out protesters.
You mean to tell me they were that bold to go to the sheriff's page with their name and say, if you guys have a protest, guess what we're going to do? We're going to shoot people?
Yeah. And so I looked at this, I'm like, wait a minute, where did I move? What the heck? And the sheriff told me, and then we all said, you know what, screw you guys, we're going to go protest anyways. And you guys know me, I have a temper, and I'm a veteran. I was in the Army. You can see some of my stuff in the background. And I was like, man, I was willing to give up my life for you idiots with your sniper rifles to have freedom of speech. You're not going to scare me away from exercising mine. So we had the protest. We're a small town of maybe, Chris, I don't know how big your town is. Ours is 12,000 when the university is in session. So really, we're about 6,000 people here. We had about 350 people show up. And I was really proud to see that. And the population is majority white, and the protest was majority white. So I was glad to see that as well. But I was speaking to the sheriff, and he said a guy called him up and said, hey, I see you're having this protest. If you want, I can rustle up a militia just like that to come support you. And the sheriff's like, dude, you better stay out of town that day.
Oh my goodness. But that's so bold. It's like, it's like the entitlement, the sense of entitlement.
Exactly.
That people have when it comes to this country. It just confuses me. And I say that because as a Black woman, and you guys touched on it, how you kind of felt when you were in China. That's how we feel every single day. And it's the fact that you just want to go out and have a peaceful protest, and people are talking about they're going to send snipers out when only thing you're doing is exercising your freedom of speech. But then that's the first thing that people cry about, oh, I can't exercise my freedom of speech. Oh, I want to carry my gun, and all of these things. But then to give people those same rights, that's an issue for me. And I really think that kind of leads into white privilege. And now, guys, I didn't put up my APA citation on this one because I stole it from Wikipedia and I forgot how to do that citation. So white privilege is societal privilege that benefits white people over non-whites in some societies, particularly if they are otherwise under the same social, political or economic circumstances. And I think we kind of touched on that based on what happened in UAE versus now what's happening in the United States. Because in the United States, we know even people associate white privilege with class. And it's not really that. It's based on the color of your skin, you're given certain rights and privileges that someone who does not have your same color skin tone may not have. And something as simple as you're going to the store and the security guard follows you because you're Black and they think you're going to steal something, versus you're white and they figure, oh, everything is fine, but then you're in there stealing. So it's that preconceived notion that because a person's skin color, which is something you can't control, and you can't control it, that at this point, people are using that against you. And I wanted to talk about white privilege, one, because people, and I know you and we've had conversations, so we all are in agreement that white privilege exists. I wanted to kind of talk about that because, Chris, you're a white man, so you're at the top of the totem pole. Like, you're like the grand dame when it comes to white privilege, because, of course, you're male and you're white. So I wanted to kind of have you talk about that. What, like, have you noticed your privilege at all, or is that something you're still trying to figure out?
Okay. So I told you I was going to try not to preach.
Preach, Chris. Oh, guys, if you don't know, I think, are you still a youth pastor? See,
I was a care pastor. You know, I grew up in the church. I remember in Germany, my mom would drive us 2 hours to get to church, and we'd show up. It was an all-day event, and because it was related into 4 different services, so if you could imagine those services, it was just a little bit. I did grow up in the church, love Jesus, but I cuss a little, so that's a little bit how
we still praying for you.
You can keep praying. But my answer, everything that I do, I try to view through the filter of what would Jesus do? How would Jesus react? So if I'm being 100% honest, I resisted the notion of white privilege for a long time. Because I understand it. Somehow I used to think that the notion of white privilege meant that I didn't have to work hard. And so that's kind of how I viewed white privilege in general. And so I began to read, like most people do, and I'm reading through the Bible, and I noticed several things about this. And so Jesus, when he came to the earth, just privilege in general, my idea about Jesus is he was not white. He was likely very darker skinned where he grew up and working outside. But I think even in our, you know, we as a white guy, and I don't know it. So anyway, let me get back on track, or I'll be here for 30 minutes trying to get my point across.
But I heard what you said about Jesus.
Jesus laid down his divine privilege as a human, and so he's 100% man, 100% God. But he laid aside his divine privilege. So we also see Jesus at some point, when he's washing the disciples' feet. I think in America, a lot of times we tried to read the Bible through our 21st century American culture, and you just can't do that. So when Jesus begins, like I joked with Dr. Isakovich one time about looking for seminal works on leadership, end up in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Leadership goes back that far, you know, and yes, Jesus was the servant leader. And even if you, so let me preface what I'm about to say. Even if you don't believe Jesus was who said he was, there's some great principles in the Bible that we can learn from. And so began at washing the disciples' feet. He took off his robe first, which signified in that culture authority and power. he laid down that privilege and washed his disciples' feet, his followers. So when I'm reading through several different things in the Bible, and in the last few weeks, we've seen this post of Jesus' temple tantrum, turning over tables and driving out the money changers. I think there's a different message we can take from what happened at the temple, but it requires some cultural context. So here, the Jews and the Gentiles all over the place traveled to Jerusalem during Passover, and one of the things that they did was they were going to make sacrifice at the temple, because that was their system of praying, their system of worshiping with sacrifice. So rather than travel 100 miles with an animal, they purchased them when they got to Jerusalem, go into the temple and have a sacrifice. The problem was when Jesus shows up in the temple, if they traveled from somewhere else, they couldn't use their coins to buy a sacrifice. They had to exchange the money first into Hebrew money, because some of the images that were on their coins were considered idolatry. So they would change the coins, then they would go over to the next table and they would buy the animal and go in and sacrifice. Again, not my point about privilege. So if you can imagine the temple, I thought about drawing it just a few minutes ago. If you can imagine the square inside a square inside a square. So when we read about the Holy of Holies, it's a small square inside a square inside a square. Then you have the inner courts. So during Passover, the only person who was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies was the high priest, which is systemic. The inner court for the Hebrews was for the Jews. The only people that were allowed to go in there was for Jews. So the inner court was the outer court. The outer court was for the Gentiles. They were not allowed to be permitted to go into the inner court. And so what happened, because of systems of religion, religion allowed the Jews. So previously, the marketplace was across the valley, the Kidron Valley, on the Mount of Olives. So they would exchange their monies there, buy their sacrifice on the valley, and make their sacrifice in the temple.
Wait a minute, Chris. I had a thought when you said this. So are you basically saying to us that there were forms of racism even noted in the Bible? So this isn't something that just appeared 400 years ago, even with slavery, but the fact that, because you talked about who was allowed in the inner courts versus who was in the outer courts, that this is something that even happened in Bible times, and therefore it has now transitioned over into the world we live in today. So this isn't necessarily new.
It's not new. Privilege. So if you look at what happened, Jesus goes into the temple. So if you read in Matthew, there's a slight nuance testimony. And so if you look at Matthew's, Jesus drives out the money changers, flips over tables, tells people to take their animals and go, basically. And declares to Matthew that this is a house of prayer, and we've made it a den of thieves. If you switch over to there's a slight nuance there where Mark is saying that this is a house of prayer for all people. And so what had happened was the religious leaders allowed these Jewish money changers to take the space of the Gentiles in the courts. There wasn't room for them to come in.
Wow.
They're using their to take up a space that was reserved for the Gentiles. And so I feel like there's an underlying message in that whole temple tantrum of destroying, standing. He's using his Jewish privilege to stand.
Wow.
And so I think it's just really important just to lay down our privilege. I don't think that laying down my white privilege does not benefit the Black community. Mm-hmm. I need to be just as righteously indignated as Jesus was about the lack of elevation of the people of color, and use my privilege not to keep other races down, but to help elevate them. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And I wanted to bring into the conversation because I started doing research on this topic. As you guys know, I am a Black woman. However, I've just been engulfed with white privilege and racism and what that looks like. And because now I'm a scholar practitioner, so I decided to really go and research and not just read articles, but actually look into scholars who study diversity, who study inclusion, who study racism. And there are two names that I wanted to show everyone, Jane Elliott and Peggy McIntosh. If you've never heard of these two women, please look them up. Jane Elliott and Peggy McIntosh. I started doing research because I wanted to figure out, okay, are there any white people who are talking about this? That was really kind of the base, because as Chris said, with your white privilege and having white privilege, the key to that is speaking to people who look like you to then say, hey, this is wrong. What can we do to make this better for the people who don't look like us? Because this is wrong. This isn't right. And the two women, what's so ironic about these two women, of course, they're older white women. Please look them up. Jane Elliott is in her late 80s. She may be 90 by now, but she did a project, experiment the day after Martin Luther King was killed called the Blue Eye, Green Eye, Brown Eye experiment. And what she talked about was I think it was third graders. And again, don't quote me, please go look this up yourself, because these are things that I'm still reading about, where she separated them based on eye color. And she treated one group as inferior to the other group because of eye color. And these were all white third grade kids, because she wanted to show them what it felt like to be different in America and how people have to actually live through that. And she did it with third graders because her philosophy is that racism is taught. It is not something that just happens. It's taught. And so children at that young age are taught to hate. They're taught to walk in white privilege at that young age, because of the fact of whoever is raising them or whatever they encounter at that particular time. So I admonish you to go look up Jane Elliott. Like I said, I've watched a few of her videos. I've read some of her papers. She is a phenomenal woman, and she talks about the fact that white privilege does exist. She also talks about that there's racism here in America. And even if you go to her website, she gives examples of statements that people say that are white privilege or racist, and they don't even know it, because she talks about unconscious bias and talks about the fact that a lot of times white people don't know that they're racist. Well, because they don't feel that in their heart, but some of the things that they say because they don't know or whatever can come across as racist because of that unconscious bias. Just basically meaning that because you were raised a certain way and you have a certain focus, that's just how you feel. And I hate to break it to people, but all of us have unconscious bias. It's just what it is. It's not a black or white thing. It's all of us have unconscious bias about things that, because of what we've been exposed to and how we've been treated, that's exactly what we have. And there was one thing, you guys, I printed out papers, that she talked about commitment to combat racism. And some of the things that Jane Elliott, again, please look her up. The information is phenomenal. For people who are millennials watching this, T.I. calls her like a saint. So if you know who T.I. is, and if he says she's a saint, and you know he's considering himself an activist, you should really look her up. But she gives examples on her website of some of the things that people say that are not necessarily intentional, but because they say them, this is the repercussion of that. And she talked about how one of the statements that stuck out to me is how this is a Black fight, basically. That if Black people want to be treated differently, if Black people want to have a seat at the table, then they need to come together and figure it out. And Jane Elliott is like, no, this is a everybody thing. And in honesty, white people should be the ones who come together and say, we're not going to tolerate this. And because we're not going to tolerate this, then these things need to change. And so in Peggy McIntosh, I have to get her article. It's from like the 80s. And again, these women, she did it, like I said, Jane Elliott did that research the day after Martin Luther King died. So that was in the 60s. Peggy McIntosh, her essay was written in the 80s, and it's called White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. The title alone sold me because I said, oh my God, what does this mean? But she actually talks about what is white privilege and why it's so prevalent in America. I admonish you to please get those materials and read them and make yourself aware. And I say that because we're going out and we're protesting and we're doing these things, which is great. But what are you really protesting? Let's educate ourselves. So when we're talking about what white privilege is, we really know what that is. Because white privilege isn't just because a guy has on a suit and he's the CEO or whatever. That's more class. It's what happens when I don't have to do anything but just be white and be here and I'm fine. Just like I've seen a few videos, and I think someone posted the video the other day and they were saying white privilege, how one guy was resisting arrest. And I mean, he beat up both cops. He snatched a baton. He hit them with it. He got into the police car and drove off in their car. And not one shot was fired and not one gun was drawn. However, we know this past weekend, a man pointed a taser from a distance and all of a sudden he's dead today. So those are just examples of some of the things that I've been researching in regards to white privilege that I thought were astonishing. And the fact that we really have scholars who do not look like Black and brown people who've been saying for years, this is an issue. This was before 45 came into office or anything. This is an issue. It's a systemic issue and we have to do something as white people. So Dr. A, why is it now all of a sudden that with the way the world is, that it feels like and I can only speak as a Black woman, it feels like it's like an aha moment for white people. It's like, oh, so now you know. Like, where were you then? Where were you here? So if you could kind of speak to that.
So I want to say I agree with you and I disagree with you. Because I think in one sense, yes, it is an aha moment in that we're seeing a great deal more white people no longer being silent.
Okay.
And starting to realize, hey, maybe I really do need to start paying attention. That before, because, listen, white privilege absolutely exists. There is no doubt about that. And white privilege for a white person means you can be very comfortable and you can have a Black friend and you can, listen to, R&B or whatever and never say the N word and all this. And you think, yep, obviously I'm not a racist because I don't do anything bad. But that's not actually the case. That's a comfort zone because white privilege allows that comfort zone. So here's where I disagree with you. I want, because I see this in my classroom, I'm going to tell you about the most uncomfortable day that I give my students, and these are sophomores, right? So these are young kids. They're young to me. You know, they're 19, they're 20 years old. The most uncomfortable day I give in my classroom, in my Principles of Management class, is when I'm teaching them about diversity. I actually teach them about implicit bias, and that we do all have that. And I start that out by saying, look, how many of you remember when you were in kindergarten and before you could read, you were, you know, either using books or using actual props? You know, you might be given a tennis ball, a baseball, a basketball, and a baseball bat. And you were asked, which one of these doesn't belong and why? And, you know, well, if you have a baseball, a basketball, a tennis ball, and a baseball bat, which one doesn't belong? The bat. Why not? Because it's different. It's not round. It has a different shape. It has a different purpose, right? Like you said, racism is learned, and it's a byproduct, if you will, of a very natural and needed cognitive process that we are taught as kids, and that is categorization. How do we group things together? Okay. One, we do need to have this cognitive ability because it sure makes our lives easier if we can group things and organize and so forth. But it also goes back to grouping things based on our cultural values, right? And so if we are taught at a young age that be wary of strangers, right? Because if you think about it, some toddler that's just learned to run, right? They don't care who you are. If you let them loose, they're going to run up to you no matter who you are, right? Because they're not thinking, oh, you're a stranger. They're just like, hey, I'm running. Boom, I just ran into you. Oh, look at you. You're a new person. Then they run again. But we teach our kids values, right? Based on our grouping. So if we are teaching our children, oh, if somebody looks different from you, or they have a different way of praying, or they have a different whatever it is, that gets embedded deeply, even if there's never any conscious of, oh, if that person kneels and prostrates on the ground, then that makes them, you know, there's no overt way of, oh, that's bad, but it's different. So we point out differences, and that's how those implicit biases get built in. So I actually take my students through an exercise where they have to, it's called the 6 circles of trust. And I actually have them make this grid, and they've got to think about the 6 people that are not family members that they are the closest to. And I have them write down their initials, and I say, okay, now so it's kind of like an Excel sheet, if you will. And then at the top, I say, okay, I want you to list their race, their gender, their age grouping, say within a 5-7 year span, their favorite sports team, their religion, their favorite music, their favorite food. And then go through that and put a check mark on where there's agreement. So if this friend of yours is white and you're white, you put a check mark there because you have the same thing in common. And when they get done, I have them look at their sheet, and everybody, and this is very human, everybody has 80 to 90% of that sucker filled. In other words, we associate and have the closest relationships, most of us do, with those that are exactly the same or very, very similar to us. And so then I take that and then I show them how that implicit bias then affects how we see the rest of the world. Because we may genuinely think, I can't be racist because I don't do anything overtly against Black people. But it doesn't have to be overt. You can cause great harm just by triggers in your head that you're not consciously aware of. And this is a very uncomfortable class session for my students because they're like, oh, wow. And it's the first time they're thinking of it. And so here's, long story short, coming back to disagree with you. Yes, it's an aha moment, but I'm still very frustrated with the amount of white people. And again, this is my own, sample size on Facebook and everything else, that still they haven't had that aha moment yet because they're not willing to self-reflect. And here's the thing: we all have as you said, we all have unconscious bias. And in fact, there's a marvelous test called the implicit association test. It's been run by professors from Harvard, I think, University of Virginia. It's a consortium, and it's been run for about 15 years now. And I can find the link for you. You go on and you can take these different tests, and it helps you to understand where your inherent biases lie, whether it's around race or gender or sexuality or nationality or whatever. There's several different categories. But you know, the people that, and specifically I'm speaking about white people here because that's where I'm seeing it happen. I mean, in order to manage your inherent biases, because we can never get rid of them. That's never going to happen. They're inculcated from being, you know, taught as an early child, but we can mitigate them. We can reduce them. And the first step of that is recognizing and being willing to say, yes, these are my inherent biases. And so if I, as an HR manager, am looking at resumes, then I have to tell myself, okay, Adrienne, you have a predilection for this. Watch it, type of thing. That's how we start to break down on that individual level of what can we do to kind of work against our own inherent biases. But the first step, the absolute first step, is being self-aware that we have to do that there is something wrong. And I guess that's what frustrates me. Yes, we are seeing an aha moment, and a lot of that is quite honestly being driven by the Black communities, and thank God. But you're right, white communities need to step up more. And I can't tell you how frustrating it is, the dead silence that I hear from a lot of white people that I know, that they just don't want to get out of their comfort zone and be self-aware and understand how they may be contributing to it.
I'm just curious. I watched a movie this weekend. I cannot remember the name of it, but he was the head of, it was a true story. He was the head of the KKK back in the 60s, and it was centered around education. Oh my God, what is the name of it? But it was the schools were segregated, and it was the Black side and the white side. They were coming together. This was in North Carolina, if I can remember the name of the but it was a great case. And out of that, the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, in that time of actually now being in the community of Black people and working with them on this project to see whether or not the schools could be integrated, he got to know this woman who eventually became one of his closest friends. She was Black, and she eulogized him at his funeral. I cannot remember the name, but he was the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. They called him CP. That's all I remember at this point. But he was the leader of the Ku Klux. What was it?
It wasn't me. My initials were CP.
But
well, you're still alive too, so
the story was so amazing because, like you said, he already had his preconceived notions, and he was the leader of the Ku Klux Klan in that area. But he had so much pressure on him because when he started noticing, like, hey, there's really nothing wrong here, and I'm really making a big deal about this, then his community turned on him. Mm-hmm. They turned on him when he finally vocalized, and he said, you know what? It is okay for the schools to be integrated. I vote for this. His vote was the final vote that then integrated the schools. Clyburn Paul Ellis. Thank you so much. His name is Clyburn Paul Ellis. I watched it this week, and it was such an amazing story because, again, he had never been in contact really with Black people. In this instance, in this experiment, he really got to see another side that he was not accustomed to. And then he ended up being turned on. Like, his community stopped using his gas station. They set it on fire. Like, they were really just trying to put him out of business. And so my question is that something that white people are afraid of? Is that if I do say something, what will happen to me? Like, are people going to turn on me? The movie is The Best Enemies. Thank you. The Best Enemies is the name of the movie. And So that's another question. I'm just wondering, because in that time, of course, it was the Ku Klux Klan, and it's still the Ku Klux Klan, you know, but his whole community, because he said, you know what, this isn't as bad as we're making this out to be. Let the schools integrate and let the kids get equal education. And it's funny because they fought for that back then, and it's still what we're dealing with today, is that we have it where people are not getting equal education. It's something so simple and basic, but even though now the schools are integrated and all different nationalities are going to schools together, our fundamental elementary education and high school education, because those are linked to communities and where you pay property taxes, are there. The disparities are there. And I know you as an educator, just curious as to, because now you're getting them at freshman and sophomore, like, have you seen any disparities there with where they're coming from, and, you know, having to kind of navigate even through that, because we're clearly not even getting the same education?
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. We actually, we pride ourselves as a university on having a significant amount of first generation students, regardless of color. And then we have, I think our current, if I remember the percentages correctly, and I may be a little off because I haven't checked it, but I think our Black students are about 7% of our student body. And then we have about 10% international students, which is very interesting for rural Missouri. But our faculty have greater diversity numbers of non-Americans. We do have lower numbers of, I think we're only at like 4% of Black faculty. But in terms of the students, when the COVID crisis hit, that's when it really became apparent to me how our students are not coming in with the same playing field. So when spring break happened is about when everything kind of exploded here. And as I think every institution in the US did, we went to fully online for the rest of the semester. And particularly among my sophomore students who are, you know, they're only in their second year, they're still trying to, you know, kind of, they've only got a year in, right? So they're getting a little comfortable with the college experience, but it's still new. And we're primarily a residential university as well. So now all of a sudden they had to go back home. And I had students that, you know, as long as they were on campus and they were coming to class, they were fine. But once they had to go home and deal with education purely online, all sorts of issues came up. Either they had no space in the house to be private for study or to be on a Zoom session because, you know, they were from a lower income family and they had a lot of people living in a smaller space, as we do tend to see, you know, like at the poverty level and so forth. Or I had students that had no internet and had to like go sit in the parking lot at McDonald's because, you know, McDonald's is just got the drive-through only, right? But in order to get to internet, to get online, to get to their classes, I had other students that, you know, now that they were back home, they were expected to be working on the farm 12 hours a day. And yet they had 6 hours or 6 classes, you know, like 18 credit hours of classes that if they were only on campus, they were fine. And now they were trying to juggle this. And it became very apparent just how unlevel the playing field is when these students come in. Now, I will say my university does, I think, a pretty good job of trying to provide a level base, because we provide a university seminar their first semester and all sorts of resources. And that's great. And it works when they're on campus. But in this pandemic, when they did not have those resources available to them, a lot of my students were really struggling. And one of the dean of our College of Education actually came up with a phrase that I thought was brilliant. And it became my personal philosophy in dealing with students throughout the rest of the semester. And that was to practice grace inflation, because you know, the students were forget if they had somebody that was sick with COVID, they were dealing with all these other issues that normally they never had to deal with. And most of my students had never been online before either. So now they're dealing with that. And so, yeah, it's, I see that in the student, and this brought that even, you know, closer to home for me to understand that students that come out of, as you said, and this actually hits white students a lot here too, because we are in such a rural area. Property taxes are obviously not that high. Schools are smaller. They don't get to even engage with a lot of people that look differently than them, because there's just not a lot around. And this, you know, and Chris, you probably, except for the, you know, as you said, you're close to the military base, so you have automatic diversity from that move 20 miles outside, and you know, you don't do that. It's not there. And so there's also that of students coming into the university. In fact, we've got an issue right now. Incoming freshmen made a really, I'm going to say, a disgusting video with a friend of hers, pantomiming, if you will, the experience of George Floyd, and on TikTok, and it went viral, and it got brought to our attention. And this has, you know, caused a lot of issues of, you know, I mean, this is not just, you know, I saw like a picture of some Penn State students, and I'm not trying to play it down, but they had like drawn swastikas on their shoulders. That's bad enough. But this was a reenactment of an innocent man being killed. And it's, you know, like, you know, number one, it makes my head want to explode why anybody would, you know, this is not a subject for satire or anything. Come on. This is horrible. And so this student, or incoming student, is coming into an environment, obviously, that doesn't tolerate that type of behavior or thought. And of course, all of us as educators were like, yeah, bring her to my classroom. Let me at her. Let me help teach her and broaden her mind. But I'll tell you this, that's also a bit of privilege of me having that thought process, because there has been so much backlash from previous and current Black students and other alums and white alums saying, you can't let her on campus. Why are you even bringing her in? You know, other students are going to have to sit in the same classroom and look at her. Why would you do that to them? Why would you traumatize them? And so I also realized that my privilege as an educator, and part of that comes back to being white, that, you know, I mean, I had a pretty easy time getting my position and everything else, that, you know, privilege comes back to, we only use our own perspective, and we don't empathize. And as soon as I started reading all these comments from students and their perspective of what it would be like to be in the classroom with that individual, not from my perspective of, oh, let me work on her and try and educate her, but from them. And I thought, this is part of the problem we have with white privilege, is we're so convinced that our perspective is justified that we tune out the other perspectives that are exactly the same level of validity, if you will, as our own, if not more. And we have to be willing to basically shut up and listen. You know, I think it's really, and I know I'm not doing a good job tonight of that. I'm rambling on.
But no, this is good. This is good. But and it's funny because I had to have this conversation with one of my millennial staff members today, because she's an advocate, like, we have to do something. We need to have work groups. We need to discuss racism. And I said, I commend you. I really do. I commend you for wanting to do something and to take action. And you feel like this is what we should be doing. But it was myself and another one of our colleagues. It was pretty much the entire senior team, but we have a mix of leadership. And I said to her, I'm going to speak to you first as the HR director, which is, I get that you want to have that conversation. But as a Black woman, I don't want to have that conversation at work. Mm-hmm. And she looked like, what do you mean you don't want to have that conversation? And just like you said, because her immediate response as a white, and of course, you know, she's a millennial, she's feisty, and I love that about her. But I said to her, because you feel as though this is the way to solve it, doesn't mean I want to endure that. As a Black woman in the workplace, especially because my workplace, we're pretty multicultural, we're international, we travel the world and deal with gender issues, children, and things of that nature. So of course, we're a very well-versed population. But I said to her, because you think we should be doing that doesn't necessarily mean that's the way to be done. And I talked to her about the fine balance of being an HR professional and how I can't alienate one to satisfy the other. And although you're white and you want to do what you want to do to assist the minority population, which is great, you're going to do that at the sense of me possibly alienating white people who may not necessarily be racist, but still don't have an understanding of what we're doing. So it's my job to educate, and not even that, to bring in people who can have these difficult conversations and don't just leave it where we're just talking and there's no solutions. And I think that's a lot of what I'm seeing now. Like, it's great now that we're having the conversations. It's great that now we're opening our eyes to what the possibilities may be. But my concern is I don't want us to have all of these conversations and leave people wounded and not be able to put it back together. And so that's why my concern, and I said to her, as an HR professional, I'm not just your HR person, I'm everybody's HR person. And because I am a Black woman, I do feel like people are looking like you have to have a fine balance, because it's, I can't be fight the power and then, also making sure that I'm fair and equal, because the minute that you're not seen that way, then you're going to have a cultural issue within the organization. And so I'm just trying to figure out, like, as we move forward, and we've seen it on the protests, we've seen white people, Black people, Chinese people, whatever, people are really coming together in this, and people are really trying to say, you know what, we're the human race, and whatever you need, and that's why honestly this conversation is so big, because now it's not just people who look like me that's having this conversation, it's everybody, and it's forcing companies to recognize. I mean, I've never seen so many announcements about Juneteenth coming out. Although, I have my concerns about that. However, I know there's some companies, because of their social consciousness, they have to do things in that manner. So I get it and I understand that, but I've never seen that. People are they're swifter now with getting things done and moving things along. And I think it's so awesome that this is happening, because of course, as we're moving forward, there are more people at the table. And that's one of the reasons why I'm honored and I'm glad that you two were able to come to the table with me today, because I don't want to just have this conversation with people who look like me. Like when you have your students do that little activity and who's your 6 people, I wanted to expand who my 6 people are in this conversation, because I realize at the end of the day, if anything is ever going to change in my sphere of influence, then it's important for me to have conversations with people who have different experiences than me, who do not look like me, and who can also give me a different perspective. That's why I said I am really concerned. I want white people to stand up. I want white people to speak out. But I'm also concerned too that when people do, I don't want it to end in death for people. Like, I don't want it to end in alienation, because I already know what that feels like. And it's not nice. And so I just want to say, because it's a little after 8 o'clock, I usually end at 8 o'clock. I want you guys to give some closing remarks. Honestly, first of all, this conversation was so fruitful. We're probably going to have to do this again because I really want to deep dive into the education systems, especially. Because as we're moving forward and they're having these conversations about Black schools are not even getting the same supplies. They're 2-3 years behind. A lot of them didn't even get laptops during COVID. It took 3, 4, 5 weeks, all of those different things. And even in the workplace, like how a workplace is, the great thing is we're all HR professionals. So maybe we need to come back and just talk about, from an HR perspective, how to strategically navigate through race relations in the workplace, because there's a whole different dynamic with that. And we have laws that govern us. There's policies that govern us. And honestly, the culture of your organization governs you.
That's right.
So even if you want to do something phenomenal and your leadership is saying, no, we're not doing that, how do you as an HR professional even navigate through those challenges and difficulties? So Chris, I'm going to let you give us some closing remarks, and then Dr. A, you can follow up right behind him. But I'm so honored and so glad that you guys were a part of this conversation tonight. So Chris?
Well, Paul, I'm very glad that you allowed me to be on tonight. I'm very humbled that you would allow me to speak. And I think the things that's really challenging white guys, for men in general, men and women think differently, is I'm a fixer. I want to fix something. There has to be something physically that I can do to fix something. And so I know a lot of my sphere of influence, we're all looking to do something. Nobody's really been able to articulate for us what we can do. I think this has been really good. I think just the conversation is phenomenal. I think we're seeing more and more white people coming out of the closet, so to speak, of racism, and there's a lot more people, I think, that are supportive of people of color that were always right. High school weeks ago, justices. And my response to him was, Mac, I didn't think I was allowed to, because I speak up or try to do something that's helpful, that I'm looked at like just some white guy that's trying to come in and be the saving knight. And just in conversations, I've had some really tough conversations lately. I don't know if either one of you have seen the issues with my son over the last few weeks, but it's led to have some really conversations with people of color I've talked to before. It's been enlightening. If anybody's watching this, not being viewed as the white knight. We need to stand with the Black community, the people of color community, because they're a segment of our community. It's not different communities. And so I think it's very important, if anybody that's white that's watching this, we don't need to stand for. The Black community is very capable, intelligent to stand up for themselves, but we need to stand with the Black community. So anything I can do, please don't hesitate to reach out. I was anticipating having some really hard questions, and y'all have been really nice.
Next time, you got to butter you up first.
So, and I think for professionals, I think I've seen several professionals, folks on here. It's time that we look at our business from a systems perspective. Our system is designed for white people to succeed. And if we can't see in there, you need to reach out to somebody, because there's a space for diversity. I was reading an article this week, and I'll wrap this up and we're over. But I was reading an article this week for my last class. I'm ABD. But for my last organizations that have a diverse executive group are 70% more likely to move into new markets and return 38% more revenue than the same class of their competitors if they have a diverse work executive team. It's time that we recognize, even from a business perspective, that diversity and inclusion makes sense.
Wow. Thank you, Chris. Dr. A?
Well, first, I want to echo what Chris said. I am honored and humbled to be a part of this conversation. Sharon, I mean, obviously, you know, I think the world of you as a doctoral student, but watching your leadership from an HR perspective during COVID, and don't forget, when you're done with your dissertation, we have a case study to write, but also watching your leadership in starting conversations like this is so amazingly helpful, I think, to all of us. I know I have been wrestling with thoughts over the past few weeks of, as Chris said, I want to help, I want to do something, but I also don't want to ask others, well, okay, Black community, tell me what I can do, because you guys, you don't need to be trying to babysit me. I need to be, I'm an educated person. I need to be kind of trying to figure this out. But at the same time, I don't want to come in and say, okay, I know how to fix this, because I don't. I can't do that. I shouldn't do that. And no white person should do that. So what I've started to do is just to think, okay, yes, I mean, we've got to change a lot that is incredibly systemic. And I think a lot of us being able to change that is to come together and vote, for one thing. But also, what can I do just in my own sphere to make a difference? And so I've thought about that from the perspective of being a professor of, okay, how am I going to, you know, I already do some stuff, but what else can I do? What else, how can I change the curriculum of my courses to make sure, because honestly, I tend to, when I talk about diversity and when I bring in examples, I tend to do it from an international perspective, because that's my space. That's what I'm comfortable with. But for my students here in rural Missouri, I need to do less of that, because I do teach a class on international management, and that's the space for that. But in principles, you know, I was watching that amazing documentary 13th. And I thought, instead of me discussing business ethics and using the example of a 12-year-old Bangladeshi kid who is working full-time in a garment factory because he's supporting his whole family, yes, that's an ethical situation. But a much more immediate situation for the students to learn about is prison labor, and how that feeds into our systemic racism and how that's a byproduct of it. That's a much more immediate issue that I should change that part of my curriculum. So that's one thing I think I can do as a professional, but also just as a white person and as a white woman, I've given myself the task of, and I'm kind of putting this out there for anybody else who is white and listening, and actually not just even white people, but for all of us, I think, but particularly white people. Learn when to shut up. If someone else is talking, just listen, and try and not listen through my lens, but try and listen through their lens. And I know this sounds schizophrenic, and maybe I am, but also at the same time, while I'm shutting up, I decided to stop being silent as well. And so what I mean by that is, so Facebook, I really have a love-hate relationship with Facebook. It's not my favorite social media. And I've used it over the years because living internationally, it was the easiest way to keep in touch with everybody, because, you know, we don't write individual letters anymore. We don't even write emails anymore. It's just easier to put a posting. And then I can also see, you know, what my friends are doing and family around the world. And so I've kept it for that reason. But I've also kept it as just a space to keep up with people. And I haven't brought my politics into it or my values or anything else. But as part of, I guess, my aha moment is, as I'm listening to others, I've also decided, okay, you know what? You're my friends and family. You're going to now know exactly how I feel. And I'm going to put out some blanket statements. And I've started doing this on social media, like, you know, especially about the Confederate flag, you know, and again, I come from the South. And I've made it very clear to my friends and family that, you know, if you are, you know, still defending the Confederate flag, I pretty much think that that's a sign that you are racist. And I'm actually, I'm not calling out people by names, but I'm no longer being silent because it's comfortable to be silent. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So I'm listening to others, but I'm forcing myself to be uncomfortable and challenge people as well. And I'm hopefully, will I change the world by doing that? Probably not. But if I can have one person maybe think, oh, you know what, let me just, even if they never tell me, but they start thinking, then that's, even if we build it little by little, maybe that's how we actually enact lasting change, because that's what we need, is lasting systemic change.
I totally agree. Well, thank you both so much for your thoughts, your honesty, and your openness to have this conversation and be transparent with us about your experiences, as well as what you want to do to assist in the cause. So I want to say thank you. I'm sure this will not be the last time. As like I said, there's so many other topics I believe that we all can talk about, but I want to say thank you to everybody that's tuning in. Thank you for your information in the chats, because you helped me kind of get it along. The Best of Enemies. If you have not seen that movie, please go take a look at it. It's so relevant for right now as we're transitioning and actually trying to work together as the human race. Also look up Jane Elliott. When you get a chance, look up Peggy McIntosh. Again, these are people who are thought leaders in diversity and inclusion, specifically with pointing out white privilege and racism as white educators, as white women. And so they're thought leaders in this. They have plenty of research on this. So they're not just talking about it. Like, they've actually researched these things. They actually have evidence and proof. I've learned that as a scholar practitioner. They have evidence and proof. It's not just an opinion. So look it up, educate yourself. So when you're having these conversations, whether it's in your circles, at work, in your churches, that you're well informed, and it's not just you're having emotional conversations. Because although I know this is an emotional situation, I'm emotional about the things that I see on television, it's just energized me even more to become more educated. So when I'm having conversations, when I'm expressing my opinions, I have evidence to back that up. So it's not that I'm looking like a Black woman who's just so emotional. And I want to make sure that as I'm talking to you and as I'm sharing things with you, I'm not just sharing my opinions, but I'm providing you with resources that you can now go back and research and look for yourself, to educate yourself, to then educate your children and your children's children. So thank you so much, everyone, for being with us on tonight. Next week, I'm excited, because next week I have my apostle, my pastor, my mentor, Dr. Stanley J. Gurrell. He's going to be on next week, and we're going to talk about the importance of mentorship. So I'm excited about having him come on next week, because I believe everyone should have a mentor. As you guys, she said in the beginning, Dr. A was my mentor as well as Chris. She's still my mentor. She's making me right, guys. So yeah. Mentorship is very important, and I want to talk about that, and I want to specifically talk about how to find the right mentor for you. So again, thank you so much for tuning in and listening. And for those that get this on the replay, if you have questions you want to submit to me for the conversations we're going to keep having, please feel free to send me an inbox. If you are not a member of the Coach Sharon page on Facebook, please go like, please share, set your notifications so you can see the next time we're on. As it stands right now, we're on every Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, that's 7 p.m. every Monday Eastern Standard Time. So thank you again, Dr. A. Thank you again, Chris. I'm sure in a little bit I'll be calling you Dr. P. So
Dr. P.
Dr. P.
Dr. C. Y'all are doing it. I cannot wait. So I've been waiting as long as you guys have. So I'm ready.
I know. So everyone, take care. Have a great night. And until next time, keep learning, keep educating yourself, and keep growing. God bless you. Good night.